Hi. So just to let you know about a slight change, because our discussant was unable to come, we are changing, and our new discussant is Dr. Erika Nurmza. And therefore, we might have a bit more time for questions after each talk. So our first speaker is Laura Lindsay.
So, can you guys all hear me okay? Is that fine before I start? Yep, cool. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing looking at how children decide how to refer to an object and how they align with their partner. So we can think about objects in different ways depending on the context, and these different perspectives are reflected in our referential choices. So in some cases, it may be more appropriate for me to call this a rabbit, but in others, it may be more, I can talk about it as a pet or as an individual rabbit, Flopsy. Now, some objects allow for more than one perspective, even in the same context. So I may call this a rabbit, but in the same context, it's also appropriate for me to call this a bunny. Now, adults have a default preference about what they're going to talk about how they're going to refer to this object, but they tend to follow their partner's referential precedent. So they tend to use the same name that their partner has previously used, or they lexically align with them. Now, in the adult literature, different mechanisms have been proposed to explain lexical alignment, but I'm going to just focus on two. So firstly, mediated accounts assume that speakers' referential choices are influenced by their speakers' beliefs about their partner, so be that their partner's social agency or their knowledge. Now, the collaborative account assumes that speakers want to be understood by their partner, and in doing so, they use audience design mechanisms where speakers consider what their addressee is likely to know when deciding how to refer to an object. So with this account, perspective taken and theory of mind play quite an important role. So if they've heard their partner use the word bunny, they can be sure that their partner is going to understand them if they also use the word bunny, resulting in them reusing the same name that their partner has previously used. However, unmediated accounts, such as the prime and base account, assumes that speakers' reuse of a term is just a simple response to the partner's linguistic behavior. So exposure to the term bunny activates the word form bunny in the speaker's mental lexicon, and as such influences subsequent production. So we're seeing the same effect, they're reusing the same term. Now, lexical alignment is thought to be important for communicative success because it promotes mutual understanding. So as a result, it's important to understand how this skill develops. So in this study, we're looking at how preschoolers, so 3 to 4 year old children, can adopt a conversational partner's perspective in their own language use, even if this isn't a perspective that they would normally take. And if they can, what mechanisms might be underlying this? So, can children take another's perspective on an object? Now, there are two schools of thought with regards to this question. The one perspective view assumes that children will only take one perspective of an object and therefore will only produce and accept one word. And this sort of strategy is useful for word learning because it simplifies the word learning process. But this isn't quite right because children from a young age can take different perspectives when it comes to naming an object in different contexts. So, for example, they can talk about this rabbit as a pet in context where they're contrasting this animal from a lion, or they'll talk about they may call it Flopsy when they're distinguishing this specific rabbit, or they'll call it an animal if they're comparing it with an inanimate object. So children can use multiple names to describe an object in different contexts. That is, they can take different perspectives of an object in different situations. Previous studies have also demonstrated that preschoolers realize that other people have different perspectives of objects, so that they may produce a different name than they would actually use. But given a context where other people have already established their preferred perspective, preschoolers expect them to be consistent in that choice and will protest any changes to this to precedents. Now, what we're interested in this study was to see if children can adopt their partner's perspective. So given a context where the child already has a preferred perspective, will they shift to their partner's perspective or their partner's referential choice? So can children adopt their partner's perspective in their own language use? So on the one hand, we might think that they won't. Young children protest the use of synonyms, instead deeming their partners to be wrong if they use them. But on the other hand, we might think that they will shift perspective. So some work suggests that children can take their partner's perspective into account when guiding their own production processes. For example, young children treat proper nouns as privileged information and distinguish their use of proper nouns when they'll distinguish between partners in their use of proper nouns. But the evidence is mixed for this when we look at when they come to naming other objects. We can also think of shifting of perspectives as a form of imitation, because when you're using the same name as your partner and therefore using the same perspective, you're basically imitating them. Now, very young children can imitate their partners, and in fact, children use imitation to affiliate with their partner. So if they have an affiliative goal to imitate their partner, they will. Now, because we're interested in finding out whether children can shift perspectives, we're also including a manipulation in our study, which gives children an affiliative goal, therefore maximising the chances that they're going to imitate their partner and then shift their perspective and use the same name as them. So we've run a series of 4 experiments looking at the flexibilities of children's referential choices during dialogue. So in experiment 1, we asked if children would use the same name as their partner, even if this is not the name they would usually use. In experiment 2, we asked if this generalizes to an entire category, so would they use the same name even for a different referent from the same category. In experiment 3, we asked if they do this even after they've established a name for this reference, so they've established a referential precedent. And in experiment 4, we ask if they do so even if we look at the partner specificity of this effect. And in all experiments, we're looking at if this is influenced by a social affiliation goal. Now, before we ran the experiments, we identified a series of objects that had more than one possible name. So we ran a bunch of pre-tests to ensure that in a group of preschoolers that they would spontaneously produce both names, but a preferred name was produced at least twice as frequently as a dispreferred name. So they're more likely to use rabbit as opposed to bunny. And in another group of preschoolers, they would correctly choose the target, so the rabbit in this case, from an array of 4 when given the dispreferred name. So if they heard the word bunny, they would pick the rabbit in this array. So in experiment 1, we're testing whether children can adopt their partner's perspective. And in all experiments, we're using a snap game paradigm where the experimenter and the child take turns naming pictures for each other. And if the cards match, the first person to shout snap won the cards, which is always the child. But before they played snap, children were randomly assigned to either watch a video depicting ostracism or a neutral video. And in the ostracism video, a single shape is rejected by a group of shapes, and in the neutral video, a fly is buzzing around whilst shapes play. Now, Over and Carpenter have successfully used this manipulation in preschoolers before, and they found that children who watched the ostracism video tended to imitate the non-verbal behaviours of their partner more than those who watched the neutral video. And so we're looking to see if this also influences verbal behaviour. We then played the snap game, whereby the experimenter and child take turns in naming pictures for their partner, and the experimenter always started first. So for experimental trials, the experimenter would name a picture which could be described using 2 quasi-synonymous words. Half the time, the experimenter would use a preferred name, so in this case, rabbit, and then the other half of the time, they would use a dispreferred term. And then 2 turns later, the child would name the same object, and we're interested in whether they're going to use the dispreferred term or not. So in this graph, we're looking at the proportion of responses using the dispreferred name. On the left is the dispreferred, when the prime is dispreferred, and on the right is when the prime is preferred, and red bars is when the video is neutral, and greeny-blue is when it's an ostracism video that they watch. And what we find is that children were more likely to use a dispreferred name after dispreferred prime than after preferred prime. We didn't find an effective video, and strangely enough, when you look at the numbers, it's actually going in the opposite direction that we would expect, which was weird. And we didn't find any interaction between prime or video. And in fact, in all the subsequent experiments, the video and the interaction between prime and video didn't improve model fit, and there was no effect whatsoever, so we're just going to ignore that now for the rest of the talk. So what we found in experiment 1 is that children can and do adopt the same perspectives as their partner for a reference, so they're following the referential precedent. And what we want to see now is whether this tendency generalizes to an entire category. So do they adopt the same perspective for different reference from the same category, so different rabbits? So in experiment 2, we did the exact same thing, but this time the experimenter's card and the child's cards were different. So they're showing different exemplars from the same category. So they're naming different rabbits. And do children still adopt the same perspective as the partner? Well, we replicate experiment 1's results, and what we're looking at here is just the prime effective prime type. We've got colours just to make it prettier. So children were more likely to use a dispreferred name after a dispreferred prime than after a preferred prime. We then did a combined analysis between experiments 1 and 2 to see if there was any difference in using the same or different tokens. And what you can see is that they basically show the exact same pattern. So we still see a main effect of prime in that children are more likely to use a dispreferred name after a dispreferred prime than a preferred prime. And there was no difference between the experiments. So they were just as likely to use a dispreferred name in experiments 1 when the tokens are the same, and in experiment 2 when the tokens are different. Now, what we've shown in both experiments is that children can adopt the referential precedents of the partner, and now what we're going to look at to see is what the underlying mechanisms might be, what the underlying mechanisms driving this result are. So in experiment 3, we did the same thing as experiment 2, but before they played the snap game, there was a naming phase in which the child named all the objects that would appear in the snap game. So therefore, the child is establishing a referential precedent to the experimenter about how these objects should be referred to. And then they play the snap game. Now, account assuming that alignment is the byproduct of a priming mechanism would predict a reduced alignment in effect in experiment 3 as opposed to experiment 2, because children are primed not only by their partner's production, but also by their own prior productions. And this results in competition between the two alternative names. However, accounts assuming that alignment is the byproduct of audience design mechanisms like the collaborative account suggests, would predict a much stronger alignment effect because children might assume that there is there's a reason that the experimenter has switched precedents and is using the dispreferred name. So we should see a stronger alignment effect. Awesome, and this is what we found. Well, we replicate experiment 2 results in that there is a main effect of prime again. Children were more likely to use a dispreferred name after hearing a dispreferred prime than a preferred prime. But when we do our combined analysis between experiments 2 and 3, you can see there's quite a difference in that there's a reduced tendency for them to use a dispreferred name in experiment 3 than in experiment 2. And whilst we still do find a main effect of prime, there was also a main effect of experiment in that children were more likely to use a dispreferred name when there was no prior naming as in experiment 2 than when there was as in experiment 3. So what we found so far is that children will still adopt the perspective of their partner even after they've established a referential precedent for this object, but at a reduced, it's reduced. But we can explain this result using both the prime and base account and the collaborative account, and I'll say why. So in the prime and base account can explain this result because children were primed by both the experimenter and their own prior productions, and obviously their own prior productions is their default word choice. This means that both possible names are activated, resulting in a retrieval competition between the two alternatives. Now, if you've already primed yourself with your default word, you're more likely to use that word, so this means you're less likely to use the dispreferred name. However, the collaborative account can also explain this because children expect that a successfully used referential precedent will continue to be understood by that partner. And as the experimenter was present during the naming phase, they have already successfully established that precedent. So the child might have assumed that the experimenter is going to understand what they're going to say if they use the preferred word choice, resulting in them being less likely to use the dispreferred name. So we ran our fourth experiment to see and to kind of like tease these apart. In experiment 4, we had the exact same procedure as experiment 3 in that the children named the objects beforehand. But this time, children completed the naming phase with one experimenter, and then they played the snap game with a second experimenter or a different experimenter who was not present during the naming phase. So this means that the child has primed themselves before playing the snap game as in experiment 3, but they only established a referential precedent with experimenter 1 and crucially not with experimenter 2. So the prime and base account would predict a similar alignment effect as experiment 3 because both names are activated, resulting in competition. But the collaborative account would predict a stronger alignment effect in experiment 3 because they are interacting with a different partner who they believe has no knowledge about their preferred word choice. So this is basically the same as experiments 1 and 2. So what happened? Well, we actually replicate experiment 3 results in that we still see an effect of prime in that children were more likely to use the dispreferred name after the partner had used the dispreferred name than after preferred prime. But when we look at when we do a combined analysis of experiments 3 and 4, what you can see is there's no difference between their use of the dispreferred name. So we still see the main effect of prime in that children were more likely to use a dispreferred name after the partner used a dispreferred name, but there was no effect of experiment. So there's no partner specificity effect that we would expect if the collaborative account was driving the children's use of a dispreferred name. So what does this mean? So children can and they do adopt the perspective of their conversation partner, even for different tokens of the same category, when they've already named that picture, and when they've already established a precedent for that picture with the conversation partner. And what do we think the primary mechanisms responsible for results are? So we're first going to talk about the collaborative account. So could audience design mechanisms be driving this effect? So the collaborative account assumes that speakers' choices are driven by the motivation to be understood by the partner. And our study is kind of consistent with this idea because children did use the same name as their partner did, and they did so even if they'd already established a referential precedent. But our results from experiment 4 are kind of inconsistent with this because children were less likely to use the same name as their partner when they had previously named the object, regardless of whether they had established a referential precedent or not. However, we think priming mechanisms are kind of driving the result more. So according to the priming account, speakers' referential choices are influenced by prior processing of linguistic material. And that can be either from what someone else has said or from your own previous productions. And our results are super consistent with this idea because children use the same name as their partner, but this effect was reduced when they themselves had previously named that object, regardless of whether they had established a referential precedent with their partner or not. So to sum up, preschoolers do spontaneously use the same perspective as their partner, even when this isn't the usual perspective they would normally take, and even when they have established a perspective with their partner. And what we think this is primarily due to priming mechanisms in this specific context, so in this snap game. And our researchers add to the literature demonstrating that children's language use is influenced by their input, and more specifically that their language use in interactive dialogue is dynamically responsive to their partner's behaviour. And that's it. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, yeah.
Thank you for this talk. I have just a problem with your use of taking perspective, which is a metaphor, but a metaphor which speaks to having, going into the mind of the other to some degree. And if you at the same time your evidence favors the priming account, which is a less mentalist or non-mentalist account. So could you unpack what you mean by taking the perspective?
So we're going by like Laval's term where a perspective of a certain object is using a different word. That's what we mean by perspective.
Well, I think the use of this word primes towards the collaborative view, where in fact your data shows that the priming view is correct. So maybe you should not prime your audience in this way.
Sorry.
Thank you anyhow. Okay.
Yeah, so my question ties in with that, in the fact that I'm not sure I understand why the results can be explained by a recency effect, that it's easier to retrieve the word that I've just heard rather than the word I would normally use or the word that I'd used before. Because from experiment 1-2 to experiment 3, the effect is reduced because you made the child produce the word.
Yes.
But it's still significantly different, so they use the bunny more than a rabbit, less than in experiment 1-2, but they still prefer the bunny because they've just heard it. And I think the fact that from experiment 3 and 4 the results are identical kind of suggests to me that they're not trying to align themselves with the other person's perspective, but the recency effect is the same. So they used rabbit, then they heard bunny, so they performed bunny, and the results are the same. So can you explain how this is not a recency effect? Because I think it's kind of more indicative of that account rather than perspective taking.
So let me think about this. So I guess you're taking it from a memory point of view, whereas we're going completely from this priming point of view, where what we're saying is that because they were, more often than not, they're using the preferred word that they had used already. So if you look at the graphs, it's like, whoa. So there we go. So the proportions are like, is much more reduced for using this dispreferred word bunny, which is what they have just heard. And they're proportion-wise, they are using the preferred word more often, right? So this is the proportion of dispreferred. I don't know if I'm answering this. So they're more likely, they are using the preferred word more numerically, but the fact that there's an effective prime when using the dispreferred, hang on.
Sorry, the red bar is the bunny?
The red bar is the bunny.
Right. So they use the bunny more because they've just heard it, no?
Hang on. So they were, so in experiments 3 and 4, they tended to use the preferred word more often than they would use the dispreferred word. But what we're showing here is that there is an effect of prime. Right. So if they heard the dispreferred word, they were more likely to use that dispreferred word than if they had heard a preferred word. Does that make sense? So I don't know how it could be a recency effect. Hang on, I'm really confused. I'm not answering this question very well. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm not answering this question well at all. I'm so confused.
I just have a quick question of curiosity, because you used generalized linear mixed effect modeling, which kind of like absorb the most individual differences in there. And actually, if you think about either like using the term perspective taking or like recent effect, things like this. If we think about this from a developmental perspective, there should be a lot of like individual differences. I'm just curious, like whether you happen to have data to show that how divergent each individual can be, so that we can see this from a different perspective instead of like abstracting out the variabilities from the divergence and only see the group value. And we will, for example, like this will probably provide more information for us to better understand the development of this phenomena. Thanks.
So, thank you. So I have looked at the individual data for this, so looking at each participant's alignment effect. And if I remember right, this we basically are showing most of the participants are showing the exact same. They're more likely to use the dispreferred name. They're showing the same pattern as results across the board, I think.
Oh, so in that case, why mixed effect modeling is adopted then? Is it? It's a comment probably. You can take this.
Yeah.
If it's the individual differences is like that, and if there's no like specific trend that bothers your data or that's not interpretable, I don't think from statistical perspective that it's necessary to adopt such a huge model with all maximal random structure included. You have a lot of parameters to estimate, and then ultimately, of course, it will be really, really significant. But
I mean, it is a very simple model because it has just got prime in it. There's no interaction terms or anything.
Yes, but if you
Yeah,
include max random structure, you have to estimate the parameter for each participant,
Yes.
for each random intercept
yeah.
and each random slope, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, that's
It's just the comment for you to
that's
think
cool.
about.
Thank you very much. I'll report back. Thank you.
Hello.
Where are you? Oh,
here.
hello.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. So I was thinking whether did you try any manipulation where this perspective taking would be more necessary? So for me, I think rabbit and bunny, it's equally easy for these kids. So maybe a context where one of the words is expected to be less known, or maybe there's an age difference and the younger one, where you would have a higher, where the older kid would, or the kid with more knowledge would be more inclined to actually choose the word that others showed to help him understand in this case.
Okay, so what you're saying is if we were to look at, I don't know, younger kids who may not know what the word bunny is that what you mean?
Yeah, or
Yeah.
new words, something like that.
Oh, well, so this is something that I would be really intrigued to do, is something with novel words, and see if they were kind of like, so if you were to show them the bunny and then use a completely different word and see what they would use, but I've not done anything like that yet.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello.
Yeah, hello. So my question is about the actual test here. This game. This is
Okay, yeah.
This is the snap game. So when here they just have to say a word practically. Just have to label
Yes.
the thing. But it's obviously it's not in the context when you are labeling for someone to understand, referring someone to the other person. So the question is, how much do you think this result can actually extend to normal context when children would use these labels to actually refer to the other, to pick out an individual
So I'm really happy that you've asked this question because I've actually just run another experiment where we've used a completely different paradigm from the snap game, where they have to tell the experimenter where they're moving house with an experimenter, and they're telling the experimenter where things have to go in this house. And the experimenter then has to move things from this moving truck to the house. And we still see the same effect that we see in the snap game. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I think we're going to stop now and you can ask more questions after the discussant. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.